biggest lie men believe about women. The lie that changes everything. If you're watching this tonight because someone walked away from you, ignored you, betrayed you, or simply made you question your own worth, I want you to stay with me until the very end, because what you're feeling may not have started with that relationship at all. It may have started years before you ever met that person, and until you discover where it truly began, you'll continue fighting the wrong battle. Welcome back, crowned Stoics. Tonight we are not putting women on trial, and we are not putting men on a pedestal. We are investigating one belief that has quietly shaped millions of men without most of them ever realizing it. The strange part is that almost everyone accepts this belief as normal, even though it quietly destroys confidence, purpose, and peace from the inside out. Most men think their greatest pain comes from rejection. Others believe it comes from betrayal, divorce, disrespect, or being replaced by someone else. Those experiences certainly hurt, but they are rarely the beginning of the story. They are usually the moment when a much older wound finally becomes impossible to ignore. Before this documentary ends, you'll meet men from different walks of life who all believed they were fighting different battles. One was devastated after discovering infidelity. Another spent years trying to earn love that was never freely given. Another had everything he thought he wanted, yet still felt empty every time his phone stayed silent. Their stories appear different on the surface, but they all point to the same hidden truth. That truth can be summarized by one simple question. Who convinced you that your value had to be chosen by someone else before it could belong to you? Because whoever taught you that never handed you a crown. They handed you a chain. Where the lie begins. Most men believe the pain begins the day they are rejected, replaced, or betrayed. It doesn't. Those moments simply expose a weakness that has often been growing quietly for years beneath the surface. The real question is not who hurt you, but why another person's decision gained the power to define how you see yourself. Think back to when you were a little boy. Nobody had to teach you how to laugh, dream, build imaginary worlds, or believe you could accomplish something extraordinary. Your confidence existed long before you worried about impressing anyone else. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, many men unknowingly traded that confidence for acceptance. Psychologists have studied this pattern for decades. Human beings naturally desire connection because relationships are an important part of a healthy life. The problem begins when connection slowly becomes dependence, and your identity becomes attached to another person's approval. Once that happens, every compliment feels like survival, and every rejection feels like destruction. This is where Daniel's story begins to look painfully familiar. He wasn't weak, desperate, or unintelligent, because he had built a successful career and handled responsibilities that many people would never accept. Yet every evening, after accomplishing everything expected of him, he still measured the value of his day by whether one person chose to respond to his message. If you've ever found yourself checking your phone over and over again, replaying conversations in your mind, or wondering why you suddenly don't feel like yourself anymore, I want you to understand something. That doesn't necessarily mean you're broken. It often means you've slowly handed someone else a responsibility that was never theirs to carry in the first place. The good news is that anything you can unknowingly surrender, you can intentionally reclaim. More than 2,000 years ago, Epictetus warned that freedom begins the moment you separate what belongs to you from what never did. Another person's choices have never belonged to you. Their feelings, attention, and decisions have always remained outside your control. The only thing that has ever truly belonged to you is your own character and the choices you make in response. So why do millions of men continue chasing what they can never control? Why do so many intelligent, capable men spend years believing peace is waiting on the other side of someone else's approval? The answer is hidden inside one belief that society repeats so often that almost nobody questions it anymore. In the next chapter, we're going to expose exactly how that belief quietly becomes the chain that keeps men from ever wearing their own crown. Have you ever noticed that two men can experience the exact same breakup, yet one rebuilds his life, while the other spends years trying to understand what happened? The relationship may have ended the same way, but the outcome could not be more different. One man mourns what he lost and continues moving forward. The other begins questioning whether he was ever enough in the first place. That difference rarely begins with the relationship itself. It begins with something far older than the relationship, something most men never realize they have been carrying for years. Like a crack hidden beneath fresh paint, it remains invisible until pressure finally exposes it. By then, many men mistake the crack for the cause, instead of recognizing it was already there. Researchers who study human behavior have found that people often confuse attachment with identity. Attachment says, "I deeply care about this person." Identity quietly whispers, "Without this person, I no longer know who I am." Those two ideas sound similar, but they lead to completely different lives. Now think about the messages boys receive while growing up. They are told to work harder, earn more, prove themselves, compete, impress, and eventually become worthy of someone's love. Those lessons often produce disciplined men, but they can also plant a dangerous belief beneath the surface. If a man's value must always be earned, then somewhere inside him he begins to fear it can also be taken away. This is where our investigation becomes uncomfortable. What if the greatest fear many men carry is not losing a relationship at all? What if the real fear is discovering they never learned how to value themselves without someone else's approval? That question brings us back to an ancient observation from Epictetus. He taught that suffering grows when we surrender our peace to things we do not control. Most people assume he was talking about governments, money, or bad luck. Yet one of the easiest places to surrender control is inside a relationship, where another person's choices slowly begin deciding how we feel about ourselves. If you're listening tonight, I want you to ask yourself one honest question. If every message stopped, every compliment disappeared, and every relationship ended tomorrow, what part of you would still remain untouched? Don't answer too quickly, because that question may reveal more about your life than any personality test ever could. We've uncovered our first piece of evidence, but it still doesn't explain who taught men to confuse love with self-worth. Somewhere along the way, that idea became so common that almost nobody questioned it. In the next chapter, we're going to trace that belief back to its source and discover why millions of men have been chasing the wrong prize all along. Have you ever felt this? Have you ever stared at your phone, knowing you should put it down, yet somehow finding yourself checking it again only a few minutes later? Have you ever replayed the same conversation in your mind, wondering if you said the wrong thing, waited too long to reply, or cared just a little too much? Have you ever convinced yourself that one message could completely change your mood for the rest of the day? If you answered yes to any of those questions, then this investigation is about much more than a relationship. The strange part is that it never happens all at once. It begins with one small compromise that seems harmless because it feels like love. Then another compromise quietly follows, and before long your routines, your goals, your friendships, and even your peace begin revolving around someone else's choices. Most men don't recognize the change because they are living it one ordinary day at a time. This isn't evidence that you loved too deeply. It isn't evidence that you were weak, foolish, or incapable of having a healthy relationship. It is evidence that somewhere along the way, your emotional center slowly moved outside of yourself and into another person's hands. Once that happens, every moment of uncertainty begins feeling larger than it really is. More than 2,000 years ago, Seneca observed that we often suffer more in our imagination than we do in reality. Think about how many hours have been lost, imagining what someone meant by a short message, a delayed reply, or an unexpected silence. The mind fills empty spaces with fear long before it fills them with truth. Left unchecked, those imagined stories begin shaping real decisions. Now let me ask you another question. Have you ever noticed that the people who seem the most at peace are usually the ones who don't spend every waking moment trying to convince someone else to choose them? They still love deeply, they still care deeply, and they still experience heartbreak. But they never allow another person's decision to become the measure of their own worth. That isn't confidence that appeared overnight. It wasn't created by money, status, appearance, or luck. It was built by understanding one truth that most men are never taught growing up. Once you understand that truth, you'll begin to see why so many intelligent, hard-working men unknowingly spend years chasing something they were never supposed to chase in the first place. So far, we've uncovered the symptoms, but we still haven't identified the source. Every investigation reaches a point where scattered clues suddenly begin fitting together. In the next chapter, we're going to uncover the cultural story that convinced generations of men that their value had to be earned instead of developed, and why believing that story changes the way they approach every relationship that follows. The story men quietly learn. Every investigation reaches a moment when the evidence stops pointing at individual events and starts pointing toward a larger pattern. This is that moment. The question is no longer why one relationship hurt so much. The question is why so many men respond to rejection in remarkably similar ways, even though their lives are completely different. Think about the messages you may have absorbed over the years, without anyone ever sitting you down to teach them directly. Work hard, become successful, impress people, never appear vulnerable, and eventually someone will choose you. There is nothing wrong with ambition, discipline, or becoming a better man. The danger begins when self-improvement quietly changes from becoming your best self into believing your worth depends on being selected by someone else. Have you ever noticed how quickly people ask a man who has been left, "What did you do wrong?" That question can sometimes be important because every relationship deserves honest self-reflection. But if it becomes the only question, many men begin searching for flaws that may not even exist, while ignoring the reality that relationships often end for many different reasons. Self-examination builds wisdom, but self-condemnation slowly destroys it. This is where the teachings of Marcus Aurelius become surprisingly practical. He reminded himself that another person's actions belong to their character, while his response belonged to his own. That simple distinction allowed him to remain steady in situations that would have consumed many others with anger, fear, or resentment. Imagine how many sleepless nights could be avoided if more men truly believed that principle. Now let's return to Daniel for a moment. Like many men, he believed that if he could just say the right words, become more patient, or sacrifice a little more of himself, everything would eventually return to normal. He wasn't chasing love anymore. He was chasing certainty, and certainty is something no other human being can permanently give you. If you've ever found yourself bargaining with reality, saying, "If I just change this one thing, maybe they'll come back," you're not alone. Many men have stood exactly where you're standing. The important question isn't whether they returned. The important question is what happened to the man who stopped living his own life while waiting for the answer. The evidence is beginning to point somewhere unexpected. The deepest wound is often not rejection itself. The deepest wound is forgetting that your purpose existed before the relationship, continues during the relationship, and must remain after the relationship. But one mystery still remains. If peace was never supposed to depend on another person's choices, why do so many men unknowingly hand it away anyway? The next chapter uncovers one psychological pattern that quietly turns healthy attachment into emotional dependence, without most people ever noticing it. When love becomes your identity, every investigation has a moment when the evidence suddenly points in a different direction. Up until now, it may have seemed like we were investigating relationships. We weren't. We were investigating what happens when a relationship quietly becomes the place where a man stores his identity. Think about this for a moment. Have you ever met a man who disappeared after he started dating someone? His friends stopped hearing from him. His hobbies slowly vanished. His goals were placed on hold. And every decision began revolving around one person. Most people called it love. But was it really love? Or was it the slow replacement of one life with another? Healthy love expands your life. Unhealthy dependence quietly shrinks it. At first, the difference is almost impossible to see because both can look like sacrifice. The only way to tell them apart is to ask one simple question. Am I becoming more of who I was created to be? Or am I slowly disappearing? This is exactly why the ancient Stoics spent so much time talking about character instead of circumstances. Epictetus taught that the strongest person in the room is not the one who controls other people, but the one who refuses to surrender control of his own mind. Imagine how different relationships would feel if more men entered them with that understanding, instead of believing their peace depended on keeping someone else happy every moment of every day. Let's look at another piece of evidence. Some men experience rejection, grieve, learn from it, and eventually build a better life. Others spend years trapped in the same emotional loop, replaying old conversations, checking social media, imagining different outcomes, and asking questions that can never truly be answered. The relationship ended months ago, yet the emotional courtroom inside their minds never adjourned. Why does that happen? Because the brain naturally wants closure. When answers are missing, the mind often invents them. Sometimes it blames the other person for everything. Sometimes it blames itself for everything. Neither extreme usually reveals the whole truth. Notice where every clue keeps leading us. Not back to the relationship, not back to the breakup, not even back to the other person. Every road eventually circles back to one question. Who am I when no one is choosing me? That is the question many men spend their entire lives avoiding. Yet it may be the single most important question they will ever answer. If your identity depends on another person's presence, then your peace will always leave whenever they do. So where does lasting confidence actually come from? Is it built through success, relationships, money, or respect from other people? Or have we been searching in the wrong place all along? In the next chapter, we're going to uncover what the Stoics called the inner kingdom, the one possession no rejection, betrayal, silence, or goodbye can ever take from you, unless you hand it away yourself. The one thing no one can take. Every investigation eventually arrives at a discovery that changes the meaning of every clue that came before it. This is that discovery. What if the greatest mistake most men make is not loving someone too much? What if it is forgetting to keep building the man who is doing the loving? Think about the strongest men you've ever met. They still experienced heartbreak, disappointment, and rejection because no one is immune to those parts of life. Yet somehow they remained steady without becoming cold, bitter, or emotionally unavailable. Their strength didn't come from pretending not to care. It came from refusing to let one chapter become the title of their entire story. The Stoics understood something that modern psychology continues to support. Lasting confidence is not built by controlling outcomes, but by repeatedly keeping promises to yourself. Every workout you complete, every skill you develop, every responsibility you honor, and every act of integrity becomes another brick in the foundation of your character. Over time, that foundation grows so strong that disappointment can shake you without completely breaking you. This is where Daniel's story quietly began to change. The woman he cared about had not changed overnight, and his circumstances had not suddenly improved. What changed was the direction of his attention. Instead of asking, "How do I get her back?" he began asking, "How do I become a man I respect whether she comes back or not?" That one question transformed everything. He returned to the gym, not to impress anyone, but to rebuild discipline. He called old friends not because he needed distractions, but because healthy relationships deserve to be maintained. He began reading again, learning again, and setting goals again because purpose had finally returned to the center of his life. Notice something important. None of those decisions guaranteed another relationship. None of them promised reconciliation, admiration, or applause. They accomplished something far more valuable. They helped Daniel rebuild a life that no longer depended on another person's permission to feel meaningful. If you're watching this tonight, I want to ask you something that deserves an honest answer. When was the last time you invested as much energy into becoming the man you admire as you invested into trying to be understood by someone else? That question is not meant to produce guilt. It is meant to point you toward freedom. But rebuilding yourself creates an unexpected problem that almost no one talks about. The moment you stop chasing validation, people begin responding to you differently. Some will respect the change, some will misunderstand it, and a few may even try to pull you back into the version of yourself that was easier to control. That is where the real test begins, because anyone can feel strong in isolation. The question is whether you can keep your crown when life invites you to hand it away again. The experiment. The text that revealed everything. Let's conduct a simple experiment. Imagine that two men receive the exact same text message at exactly the same moment. Neither man knows what is coming next. Neither man has time to prepare. Both read the same 7 words. I think we need some space. At first, their reactions appear almost identical. Their stomach drops. Their heartbeat accelerates. Questions immediately begin racing through their minds. For a brief moment, both men experience the same emotional pain. Now watch carefully, because this is where their stories begin moving in completely different directions. The first man immediately assumes the relationship has become a measure of his own value. His first thought is not, "What happened to us?" His first thought is, "What is wrong with me?" The second man also feels hurt because losing someone you care about is genuinely painful. He doesn't pretend otherwise, and he doesn't hide behind false confidence. Instead, he reminds himself of one important truth. Another person's decision may change his circumstances, but it does not have the authority to define his character. Over the next several weeks, the first man's world becomes smaller. He rereads old conversations, searching for hidden meanings. He checks social media, hoping to find answers that only create new questions. He delays his own life while waiting for someone else to decide whether his life should continue moving forward. The second man also grieves because healing is not the same as pretending nothing happened. He reflects honestly on his own mistakes and accepts responsibility where responsibility truly belongs. Then, little by little, he returns to the habits that made him who he was long before that relationship ever began. So let me ask you something. Which man do you think recovered first? Most people answer, the second man. They're right. But almost everyone gives the wrong reason. They assume it was because he was mentally stronger, or because he loved less, or because he didn't care as much. None of those answers explain what actually happened. The real difference wasn't confidence. It wasn't experience. It wasn't money. It wasn't age. The difference was where each man had invested his identity. One invested his identity in another person's decision. The other invested it in his own character. That single difference quietly determined everything that followed. This brings us back to the question we asked at the beginning of our investigation. Who taught men that being chosen was the same thing as having value? Because if that belief is false, then millions of men have been fighting the wrong battle all along. We'll uncover one of the oldest psychological traps in human history. The moment when seeking love quietly becomes seeking permission to believe you're enough. The invisible contract. Every investigation reaches a point where a hidden pattern suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. The evidence we've gathered so far keeps leading us back to the same unsettling question. Why do some men quietly surrender their peace long before a relationship ever ends? The answer may lie inside an agreement they never realized they signed. Most contracts require a signature, but this one does not. It forms slowly through repeated thoughts, silent expectations, and beliefs that are rarely spoken out loud. Over time, a man begins believing that if he loves enough, sacrifices enough, and proves himself enough, he will finally feel secure. Without noticing it, he has created an invisible contract where another person's approval becomes the payment for his own self-worth. Let's examine another piece of evidence. Imagine two men who both invest deeply in a relationship built on honesty, effort, and mutual respect. If that relationship ends despite their best intentions, both men will grieve because genuine love always carries genuine risk. The difference is that one man mourns the relationship, while the other begins mourning his own identity. That distinction changes everything. Grieving the loss of someone you loved is a healthy human response. Believing you lost your value because someone walked away is a completely different story. Those are two separate battles, yet many men unknowingly fight them as though they are the same. More than 1900 years ago, Marcus Aurelius wrote reminders to himself during some of the most difficult years of his life. He never claimed that pain could be avoided, nor did he pretend disappointment did not exist. Instead, he repeatedly returned to one idea: your character remains yours, even when circumstances do not. That simple observation may be one of the greatest acts of emotional freedom ever recorded. So let me ask you one honest question before we continue. If someone rejected your invitation, ended your relationship, or failed to appreciate your loyalty tomorrow, would that change your circumstances, or would it change your identity? Your answer may reveal where your emotional foundation has been built all along. In our next investigation, we'll uncover why the human mind often confuses emotional uncertainty with love, and why that misunderstanding keeps millions trapped in cycles they don't even recognize. Why uncertainty feels like love. Every investigation eventually uncovers one clue that forces us to rethink everything we believed before. This is that clue. What if many men are not actually chasing love at all? What if they are chasing relief from uncertainty and mistaking that relief for love itself? Think back to a time when someone important suddenly became distant. Maybe the phone stopped ringing as often, the conversations became shorter, or the warmth you once felt slowly disappeared without explanation. Most people immediately begin searching for answers because the human mind dislikes unfinished stories. When certainty disappears, imagination often rushes in to fill the empty spaces. Modern psychology has observed something fascinating about uncertainty. When information is incomplete, the brain naturally keeps returning to the unanswered question, almost as if it believes one more thought might finally solve the mystery. That is why some people replay conversations hundreds of times, searching for a sentence they somehow missed. They are not weak for doing this. They are experiencing a very human response that becomes harmful only when it takes control of their lives. Now compare that observation with something written nearly 2,000 years ago by Seneca. He warned that much of our suffering comes not from events themselves, but from the stories we continue telling ourselves about those events. Isn't it remarkable that ancient philosophy and modern psychology arrive at nearly the same conclusion through completely different paths? Sometimes the greatest prison is not the situation itself, but the meaning we attach to it. Let's return to our investigation. Suppose two men both receive no reply to an important message for 3 days. One immediately concludes, "I've done something wrong," while the other thinks, "I don't know what's happening yet, so I'll wait before creating a story in my head." The external event is identical, but the internal narrative is completely different, and that narrative quietly shapes everything that follows. This is why emotional discipline matters so much. Emotional discipline does not mean pretending you don't care, hiding your feelings, or refusing to love deeply. It means refusing to let assumptions become facts before the evidence exists. That single habit can prevent months and sometimes years of unnecessary suffering. So the evidence now points us toward another question. If uncertainty has the power to consume so many intelligent, capable men, how do we stop surrendering our peace every time life refuses to give us immediate answers? History offers an unexpected clue, and it comes from the daily habits of people who refuse to let uncertainty become their master. In our next investigation, we won't examine another relationship. We'll examine the quiet routines that rebuild a man's mind long before they rebuild his confidence. Because the strongest men rarely become strong during the crisis. They become strong through the ordinary decisions they make when no one is watching. What the strongest men do differently. Every investigation eventually reaches a surprising conclusion. The men who recover the fastest are not always the toughest, the richest, or the most experienced. More often than not, they are the men who refuse to let one painful event become the center of their entire identity. That observation has appeared throughout history so consistently that it can no longer be ignored. Have you ever noticed that truly grounded people usually continue living their lives even while carrying heavy burdens? They still go to work, keep their promises, exercise, spend time with family, and move steadily toward their goals. They are not pretending the pain doesn't exist. They simply refuse to give pain permanent authority over the direction of their lives. Researchers who study resilience have observed that people recover more effectively when they continue engaging in meaningful routines instead of placing their entire lives on hold. Ancient Stoics reached a remarkably similar conclusion centuries earlier, although they used different language. They believed that disciplined action steadies the mind when emotions become unpredictable. History and modern psychology arrive at the same destination from two different directions. Let's examine another piece of evidence. Imagine a man who stops exercising, isolates himself from friends, abandons his goals, and spends every evening waiting for one message that may never arrive. Now imagine another man who still grieves honestly, but continues honoring the responsibilities, habits, and values that shaped him long before the relationship began. Which life is more likely to become stronger 6 months from now? The answer isn't about willpower alone. It is about identity. One man quietly says, "My life is on hold until someone else makes a decision." The other says, "My life continues because my purpose was never built on another person's decision." That brings us back to something many people overlook. The opposite of emotional dependence is not emotional distance. It is emotional stability. A stable man can love deeply without losing himself because he has built his life on foundations that remain standing even when relationships change. If you're watching tonight, don't ask yourself whether you've ever been hurt. Every person who has loved sincerely will eventually experience disappointment in one form or another. Instead, ask yourself a different question. What habits have I allowed to disappear while I was waiting for life to feel normal again? Sometimes the first step toward healing is not another conversation. It is another workout, another book, another prayer, another early morning, another promise kept to yourself. The evidence is becoming impossible to dismiss. Confidence is rarely rebuilt by one dramatic breakthrough. It is rebuilt through hundreds of ordinary decisions that nobody applauds, but that quietly reshape the man making them. But our investigation is not over. There is still one question we have not answered. If discipline rebuilds a man, why do so many people abandon it the moment love enters their lives? That final clue may explain why so many men lose themselves without ever realizing it. The day you stopped leading yourself. Every investigation reaches a moment when all the scattered clues begin pointing toward the same conclusion. We've examined rejection, uncertainty, identity, discipline, and emotional dependence. At first, they appear to be separate problems. Now they're beginning to look like different symptoms of the very same cause. Here's another question worth asking. When did you stop making decisions because they reflected the man you wanted to become, and start making them because you were afraid of losing someone else? That change rarely happens in one dramatic moment. It usually happens so gradually that a man doesn't notice he has surrendered the steering wheel of his own life until he no longer recognizes the direction he's traveling. Consider this for a moment. A man skips one workout because he's hoping she'll call. He postpones one goal because he's trying to save the relationship. He tells himself he'll get back to his purpose after things feel normal again. None of those choices seem life-changing on their own. Yet weeks become months, and months become years. Eventually, he isn't mourning only the relationship. He's mourning the version of himself that slowly disappeared while waiting for someone else's decision. History offers an interesting pattern. The people remembered for extraordinary character were rarely those who lived without loss. They were the ones who refused to abandon their principles while experiencing it. They understood that circumstances may interrupt your plans, but they never have to interrupt your character. This brings us to one of the most practical lessons in our investigation. Before asking whether someone is choosing you, ask whether you are still choosing the habits, values, and responsibilities that once made you proud of the man in the mirror. That question shifts your attention from what you cannot control to what you can build today. It's a small change in perspective, but it often becomes the turning point in a man's life. Now let's return to the invisible contract we uncovered earlier. It quietly promised that enough sacrifice would guarantee enough security. The evidence has shown us something different. Love can be freely given, faithfully protected, and still come to an end, because every relationship involves two people making choices. That realization is not meant to make you cynical. It is meant to set you free. When your identity is rooted in your character instead of another person's approval, you become capable of loving more honestly, not less. You stop negotiating your values in exchange for temporary reassurance, because your peace is no longer for sale. We followed the clues through psychology, history, and Stoic philosophy. Only one mystery remains. If the answer was never becoming the prize, then what should a man actually spend his life becoming? Answers that question. And when it does, you'll discover that the crown we've been talking about since the beginning was never something another person could place on your head. It was something you either honored or quietly laid down yourself. The crown was never missing. Every investigation ends with a final report. The evidence has taken us through heartbreak, uncertainty, identity, psychology, and the writings of ancient Stoics. At first, each clue seemed unrelated. Now they reveal one unmistakable pattern. The deepest wounds rarely begin when someone leaves. They begin when we quietly abandon ourselves. Let's return to the question that started this documentary. Who convinced so many men that their value had to be confirmed by someone else before it could become real? The truth is that there was never one single voice. It came from small experiences, cultural expectations, painful disappointments, and the stories we repeated until they felt like facts. That realization changes everything, because it changes where the solution must begin. If another person's approval did not create your value, then another person's rejection cannot erase it. Relationships can enrich your life, challenge your life, and even transform your life. They were never meant to become the foundation that holds your entire identity together. Throughout this investigation, we followed the lives of men who made different choices after experiencing similar pain. Some spent years trying to rewrite the past, hoping one more conversation would finally bring peace. Others accepted the loss, learned what they could, and returned to building a meaningful life. The difference was not that one loved more and the other loved less. The difference was where each man decided to place the weight of his identity. Think back to the crown from the opening of this documentary. It sat alone on ancient stone while the camera quietly moved past it again and again. It never disappeared. No one stole it. No one earned the right to keep it from its rightful owner. That crown represented your character. It represented your integrity when no one was watching, your discipline when motivation disappeared, your courage when fear demanded surrender, and your willingness to keep growing whether life applauded you or ignored you. Those qualities cannot be handed to you by another person, and they cannot be taken away unless you willingly trade them for something less. So what does this investigation ask you to do tomorrow morning? Not to become cold, not to stop loving, not to build walls so high that no one can ever reach your heart. Instead, build a life where love becomes part of your purpose instead of replacing it. Keep your promises to yourself with the same determination that you keep promises to others. Invest in your health, your faith, your family, your friendships, your work, and your character, because those are the foundations that remain standing when life becomes uncertain. If you're watching this after a breakup, after betrayal, after silence, or after questioning your own worth, remember this one truth. You do not have to deny your pain to reclaim your direction. Grieve honestly, learn humbly, forgive wisely when you're ready, and continue becoming the kind of man who can stand with peace whether someone stays or someone leaves. This was never a documentary about proving that men are the prize. It was never about winning a competition between men and women. It was about discovering that peace, purpose, discipline, and character are not prizes to be awarded by another person. They are responsibilities to be cultivated by the person you choose to become. So I'll leave you with the same question that quietly echoed through this investigation from the very beginning. When no one is watching, when no one is applauding, when no one is choosing, Who are you becoming? Because that answer will shape every relationship you ever have. More importantly, it will shape the relationship you have with yourself. Until next time, crowned Stoics, master your mind. Wear the crown.